All right, guys, welcome back for chapter 3. This is our last chapter of unit 1, and today we're going to be talking about federalism. So some learning targets here. We're going to discuss just the historical origins of federalism, how it came about, and how it's evolved over time. Additionally, we'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of this federal structure in the United States, and then we'll talk about federal-state interactions, specifically in regards to funding and how this relationship has changed over time. And then we'll discuss whether the devolution of programs into the states, which really begins in like the 1980s, has kind of constituted a revolution within federal-state relations and how that works. So if we're going to kind of summarize our learning targets here, we're talking what is federalism and how has it changed and evolved in the United States over the course of our history. So these are just your guiding questions from the book here. Where is sovereignty located in the American political system? Sovereignty is just like ultimate authority. So we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, but according to the Constitution and the Supremacy Clause, the federal government ultimately has the say in any conflicts between federal and state law. How is power divided between the national government and the states under the Constitution? To be brief, it is shared, right? There are certain powers that the federal government has, and there are certain powers that the state government has. What competing values are at stakes in federalism? Really, the arguments around federalism come down to a disagreement between states' rights and federal power, right? Like, generally speaking, we'll talk more about this when we get to political ideologies. But for the most part, conservatives are going to be in favor of more state power, where liberals are going to be more likely to support greater federal power. So we have some political disagreements that arise out of the issue of federalism. Then who decides which matters ought to be governed mainly or solely by national laws? I think that's kind of a matter of opinion. Your textbook will talk a little bit more about that, right? But how we decide which issues should be dealt with federally versus which issues should be dealt with at the state level really is dependent on the political process, how it plays out, and what the people think about any given issue. So federalism is a system in which the national government shares power with state and local governments. And we use the Constitution as our document that divides out that power. So within the Constitution, we lay out all of these different powers that the federal government has, and then we say, and the other stuff, that's powers reserved for the states. Now, we're going to have some conflicts within the federal system. And so the most persistent source of political conflict is really between national and state governments and who should have the ultimate say. So the issues with this conflict they've really changed over time. The Constitution is a really vague document, right? And so we have the necessary and proper clause that says, hey, the federal government can do more than what's in this document. And then we have the 10th Amendment that says if it's not in this document, that's a power reserved for the states. So that's where a lot of the conflict comes from, is this discrepancy between the necessary and proper clause and the 10th Amendment. So the Constitution is going to leave room for interpretation. And so we're going to take a look at a number of Supreme Court cases in the coming days that deal with the issue of federalism. Is that the power of the state or the power of the national government? So this whole federalism idea is a really revolutionary idea that had been talked about by like Enlightenment thinkers and some of our founders, but this is a bold new plan that no one has tried before. So we're really not sure how this whole division between state and federal government is going to work in practice because there's no precedent. Okay, we set up this government where really neither level of government is completely supreme. In Federalist 46, they talk about how the federal governments and the state governments are totally different agents with totally different powers. Um, and so ideally, that's what's going to happen. But as this kind of starts to work, we realize that there's more overlap and more conflict between who should have the power and who should not when we actually put this into practice. Now, the idea behind a federation is that it's going to derive its power directly from the people because the people can shift their support between state power and federal power. And if the people at any point feel that their rights are being invaded by one level of government or the other, they can use the other level of government to combat that violation of rights. Now, like with anything in the Constitution, we have really elastic language. We have this flexibility in definition, and that's going to create conflict within the system. Now, how is this system different from systems that have been used in the past? First, the most common system in the world at this time and still today is the unitary system of government. And so in a unitary system, you have all of the government power centralized, just one national government, more or less. And so all power is derived from that national government. States and local governments more or less act as satellite offices of the national government. They do not have their own set of powers. They're just there for the convenience for their constituents. And so there's tons of examples of unitary systems, but some modern unitary systems include the United Kingdom and France. And like I said today, this is still the most common system in the world. So state governments, local divisions of government really don't have any power in this unitary system. Power is centralized. The opposite of a unitary system and what we try under the Articles of Confederation is a confederate system where the states have all the power and they give a teeny bit of power to the national government just really for the purpose of unity, right? Like under the Articles of Confederation, our national government can declare war together, right? Those sorts of things. But really, there's not many modern day examples of these confederal systems because they just don't work in practice. The closest thing I can think of to a modern example would be more on an international scale. So, like the United Nations or the European Union maybe would be close, right? Because the countries involved in those systems maintain their sovereignty, but give a little bit of power to the United Nations or the EU to discuss more overarching policy and to kind of act in unison. But there's really not many modern examples of this. So that brings us to the federal system, right? So like I said, in our federal system, we divide power between state and central governments. And both governments at all times are acting directly upon the citizens. So as a resident of North Dakota, I'm subject to North Dakota law and US law at the same exact time. And the Constitution is the governing document that divides out that power. So some examples of federal systems today obviously include the United States. In addition, Canada has a federal system, and I think about another 20 countries or so. Now, in a federal system, if we want to change the governing document, so in our case, the Constitution, we must agree to that change on both levels of government. So we have to agree to it at the state level and the federal level. So the amendment process in the United States is we need 2/3 nationally to approve, and then 3/4 of the states to ratify or to formally approve of that change. So a constitutional amendment by no means is an easy thing to get passed through. The next section here is called the debate on the meaning of federalism. In your book, I'll talk more about the same thing under that heading. But a lot of the conflict within the federal system is about who has power and in which cases. This has been an ongoing debate for centuries after signing of the Constitution, and it still exists today. We've set the precedent that the Supreme Court ultimately decides who has the power and in which case. McCulloch versus Maryland is the first major case revolving around the issue of federalism and the supremacy clause, and we'll talk more about that in the coming days. It actually used to be a practice that the states could nullify or cancel federal law if they felt that that federal law violated the Constitution. Jefferson and Madison actually argue for this and talk about it in their writings. The Supreme Court has found that that is not a viable practice. So you can't just say, we're not going to enforce this federal law in the state of North Dakota. It doesn't work that way. We can't nullify that law even if we don't agree with it or don't think that it's within the power of the federal government. That's ultimately up to the Supreme Court to decide. The 14th Amendment, again, gives some supremacy to the federal government over the states when that's added after the Civil War, just clarifying that states cannot declare laws void. So we have this ongoing debate about who has power and when, and that's ultimately going to be decided in our Supreme Court today. Now, there's a couple different types of federalism. The first we call layer cake federalism, which is actually called dual federalism. And this is really what the founders envisioned federalism would look like. They thought that programs and authority would be clearly divided between the national, state, and local governments, and they would kind of operate in separate spheres at the same time. So, for example, they say, hey, the national government's going to have power over interstate commerce, which is commerce between the states, and states are going to deal with intra-state commerce, so the commerce that's happening within their borders. And there's not going to be a mix or overlap of that authority. Now, what we see start to happen in practice is cooperative federalism or marble cake federalism, which basically says that programs and authority are really mixed. There's not a clear divide amongst state, national, and local governments. So for example, with the interstate highway system, that was originally set up by the federal government, originally funded The federal government set up the goals, the guidelines, all of that, but the states pay for construction and maintenance, right? So we have this overlap within one program, the interstate highway system, where states are funding part of it, the federal government is funding part of it, the federal government is making rules regarding it. And so we have kind of this overlap between state and federal power. Um, and that's where a lot of the conflict within the federal system comes from. Now, this asks, why is there no debate amongst like the powers between state and local governments? And that's because constitutionally speaking, local governments do not need to exist. They do not have any constitutional power, and so there's nothing they can work off of to say that they should have that power because the Constitution doesn't give them any power. Now, in recent years, we have seen increasing state sovereignty, meaning that states have really strengthened their constitutional power. In the early years of our republic, we actually saw a lot of expansion of federal power, and more recent SCOTUS cases or Supreme Court cases actually have limited the power of the federal government and given more power to the states. All right. So a couple things here regarding just like what states can do, what powers they have. States on their own can do things like pass initiatives and referendums and have recalls and these things that we don't really do at the national level. They can write that sort of stuff up in their constitutions. State constitutions tend to be very lengthy, so they can kind of lay all of that out how they want to do it. But constitutionally speaking, states have the power to ratify amendments, to conduct elections, to establish local governments if they see fit. They can regulate commerce within their borders, issue like business licenses, driver's licenses, teaching licenses, and they also have police power. So they have the power to promote health, safety, and morals within their state. The federal government, constitutionally speaking, can propose amendments, can declare war, like run the military, foreign trade policy, sign treaties, print money, right? All of those things that you find within the text of the Constitution really are mostly federal powers that are laid out. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about federal and state relations, specifically when it comes to funding. And this is going to be like the last slide that I record current day. I have already pre-recorded the rest of this lecture, picking up with the intergovernmental lobby. So if you notice a little bit of a shift in the audio here, that is why. But when it comes to federal-state relations, a lot of our kind of relationships between the states revolve around money. Who pays for what programs? How much do they cost share, right? So the federal government is going to provide the states with money for a lot of different needs through what we call grants and aids. And originally, grants were issued to states kind of based on what needs the states express to the federal government. So the states would say to the federal government, hey, we're really having a problem with um, healthcare in our state, and we need more hospitals, and we need more money to fund those things. And so the federal government would say, okay, we understand that's an issue for you. We'll issue you a federal grant so that you can serve the needs of your people and you can have some additional money to be able to meet the needs of your people. Now, starting around the 1960s or so, this dynamic kind of begins to change. And so even today, grants and aid are issued more so based on a perceived national need. So what does Congress think is a problem? And then our Congress people are going to say, hey, we think this is a national problem. We're going to give the states some money to deal with that problem. So instead of states saying, here's our problems, help us out, now we're having national representatives, right? Like our representatives in Congress saying, we think this is a problem, so we should give every state money to deal with that problem. So grants today are based less on what's demanded by the states and more on perceived national needs by officers of the federal government. So that could be issues like healthcare or pollution or poverty, right? Those are all different things that the federal government has passed laws regarding, and then states are going to receive money as a result of that law passing, not because they requested it, but because it's a perceived need. So, the next few slides here we'll pick up on the rest of the lecture. Please let me know if you have questions. Otherwise, finish watching here and have a good rest of your day, guys. All right, guys, so we left off talking about federal and state relations. Specifically, we talked about grants and aid, and then started talking about the intergovernmental lobby. So an intergovernmental lobby is just a association of public officials. So governors have associations, mayors have associations, and they're going to lobby on behalf of their general interests. So they might lobby for all of the states or all of the major cities, but they're not going to be looking specifically for North Dakota needs or for like Fargo needs. So it says in your notes there, we're advocating for states and cities generally, not specifically. We talked about two types of grants. The first was categorical grants, and that's when money is designated for a specific purpose. This can be a little bit confusing because categorical makes us think of categories, but try and remember that's just for one specific purpose. The problem with categorical grants is that they're really hard to adapt to your local needs. So for example, the state of North Dakota, they might need a new premier medical facility in the area, or they may need little small clinics in their small communities. And so it can be hard to adapt money that's given for a specific purpose, like building a hospital, to our local need of maybe more doctors in small communities, and so on. So block grants are the block of money that's given for a broader purpose. And this was a new type of grant that was created in the 1960s in a response to concerns from state and local officials. They said, okay, you guys, now you're telling us these are perceived national interests and we're going to give you money for those, but we don't necessarily need exactly that in our state. So instead, could you give us money for a broader topic? For example, maybe instead of providing money for a new medical facility, you are going to provide us money for healthcare, and we can use that money however we need to address the issue of healthcare in our state. We have rivalries among the states. So we call the main rivalry between states the snow belt versus the sun belt. So the idea in this rivalry is that the government unfairly helps some regions at the expense of others as populations shift. So maybe as more people move from colder states to warmer states, with those people, funding doesn't always follow. And so sometimes states that are losing people are still getting money for maybe more people than they have, while states that are growing are suffering because of the issue of population shift and not having the available resources that they need. Um, so this is obviously more of an issue when our grants are based on a distributional formula. So if something is based on a census count, more people equals more money. Now, in some cases, this can be good for either side. So for example, if a program was created a while back and it was done on a distributional formula and they haven't updated it, that could be a problem for shifting populations. But this can also be to the benefit of growing populations too. For example, if this is something that we readjust every year to keep up with population changes, the places that are growing are going to get a lot more money because they have a lot more people. Where small little North Dakota that isn't super populated isn't going to get much money. And that might be of a disadvantage to us because there's a lot of programs where there's just a cost and the per person cost on top of that initial cost is not all that much. And so small states like North Dakota might have to pay a lot more in initial costs to set up a federal program because we don't have enough people to get enough money to pay for that. So the pros, though, of a distributional formula is one, they are a pretty exact measure, right? It's not like Los Angeles, which is way more populated than our whole state, is going to be short a ton of money. They're going to give it based off of what they perceive as needed per person. But the con is that there needs to be some benefits for everyone. If we did a distributional formula for everything, states like North Dakota would suffer because they have a small amount of people. So a single allocation formula doesn't always work for small states. Then we have mandates. And so a mandate is an official order or a commission to do things. And generally here we're going to be talking about federal mandates. So things that the federal government requires us to do. Mandates are things we must follow whether or not we accept aid from the federal government. So they can say, for example, you need to change your drinking ages to 21. And then we'll give you more money for your interstates. And that was kind of one of the deals that took place when they were transitioning to a 21 national drinking age. And so when they said that, they kind of stated that as a mandate. And so you need to change that to 21 whether or not you're going to accept aid. So you can't just deny the highway funding because the highway funding is really important for your state. And so you have to do this in response. There are some waivers that do allow rule violations or allow you to kind of loophole your way around a mandate. So they may waive certain parts of a mandate. This is pretty common in the Department of Education. For example, we recognize that there's, based on demographics, a lot of different needs in education. And so what works best for a majority of states might just really not work for, say, a very diverse population in a big city or something like that. Most mandates do concern civil rights or environmental protection. School desegregation plans are the best known example of federal mandates. So they're usually court mandates more so, like the court decides on some um, new sort of responsibility, or we need to not be discriminatory and so on. And so they'll say, states, you have to enforce our decision. And it's not necessarily always the president saying this is a new regulation that we're setting up. So those would be federal mandates. You must do these whether or not you're going to receive aid from us for doing them. Example, as I kind of mentioned, in 1984, President Reagan signed the NMDAA, which is the National Minimum Drinking Age Act. And this law required the states to raise the drinking age to 21 or face the loss of 10% of their highway and transportation budgets, which was just non-negotiable for states. They needed that money. And so this is a mandate set out by the federal government. You have to do this or you're going to lose funding. And even if you say, well, I don't need the funding, you have to do it regardless, according to this act. Sometimes we have conditions of aid, so you need to do certain things to be able to receive aid. And that makes a ton of sense, right? You need to follow the regulations to be able to get the money. For example, with the Every Student Succeeds Act, if you're going to get any federal money, your state has to be compliant with that education policy and so on. All right, a devolution revolution. So devolution is the transfer or delegation of power to a lower level, especially from the central government to a local or regional administration. So in other words, federal to state power. There's been many federal functions devolved to the states. For example, most Americans first favor devolution, but they don't if that means cutting government programs that benefit citizens. So we don't want to transfer Social Security back to the states because then we would lose some funding. But in other cases, we would like to transfer money back, or we would like to transfer programs back. So what are some of the consequences of devolution? One, there is cuts in federal funding. So if you're going to take this on and you're going to be the boss in figuring out this program, the federal government's not going to provide money for that program to the states. There are actually more, not less, regulations because the national government still wants states to comply. So they, in ESSA, even though they give power in education back to the states, they make sure that your program lines up with ESSA, so you have to send that back in for approval. So that's a regulation. That's another step we have to do because the national government wants to make sure we're still complying. And then it has also led to decreased welfare. Again, if you're going to run these welfare programs at the state level, then you have to take some cuts to that funding. By 2011, many states had lost all of their budget surpluses and faced debts. And many claim this is a result of devolution. And it leads states to consider which responsibilities are theirs and which they wish would belong to the federal government or should belong to the federal government. So I want you to think a little bit about like how could states address their long-term debts? Is it a better idea for us to transfer some power back to the feds? Do we need to change our taxation system? Brainstorm that question a little bit. And then the final question is, why is there so much political and policy diversity in the United States? And I want you to pause the video, answer this question. All right, I have a couple ideas for you. So if you haven't filled in your box yet, again, please pause and finish up. But these are a couple of my ideas. First, state and local government retain constitutional protections. Because of that, we have lots of states and lots of different local interests. And so they have those powers to do a lot of different things. Also, Congress members really think of themselves as representatives of a district um, and of many different constituencies, even though they're from the same district. So even though that they represent one population, there's probably a lot of different diversity in that population itself. For example, like the state of North Dakota is represented by one congressman. So obviously we have a lot of different competing interests even in one congressman's district. The book also argues that we have weakening political parties, and that has led to a lot of political diversity in the United States in the form of third parties and um, sort of smaller factions of our major political parties and so on. And then we have, like, this whole chapter has been about differing views on federal versus local control or national versus states' rights. So, if you have any questions on the last page here of notes that we didn't get through in class, I want you to write those in your margin, and then I want you to bring them to class with you by Tuesday so that we can answer any questions that you have prior to the topic test. Thanks so much.